button on your menu bar. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Bailey and her presentation titled "The Environment Belongs to Everyone, Equity and Inclusion in Natural Resource Management and Conservation." Dr. Bailey, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this series. And thanks everyone for being here. We've got a great turnout. I see lots of familiar faces. So it's a joy to see all you here. Speaking of which, while I'm sharing my screen to get us all started, there are probably a few moments that I might ask for your engagement in the chat. So the concept of joy and happiness actually informs a lot of the work that I do. So while I'm switching into screen share mode for my slides, I would love if you could put into the chat something that has brought you joy recently. It can be interpreted however you see fit. Awesome team, cool weather, family, dog, ceramics, pumpkin spice chai, talking to your best friend. Yeah, weather, food, deep conversations, the first snow, absolutely. Wonderful, hiking, my son's laughter, right? Laughter's such a joyful thing. Bhakti chai. Indeed, always supporting food and drink as things that bring us joy. Taking walks. Yeah, thanks everybody for contributing, and it's really great to hear what is bringing you joy. So and I'll talk a little bit more about how I think about joy in my work as we move forward with the content. But so the title of my talk is "The Environment Belongs to Everyone, Equity and Inclusion in Natural Resource Management and Conservation." Oh, my two chihuahuas. And as I was preparing today, I kind of was questioning this title. I think if I were to rework this, I might rethink the word belong. It implies a sense of ownership that I don't love. And so when I think about the environment, this concept of belong, own, connection is something that's, I think, important to take a critical eye to. So that's just more information than you needed about the title. So just a little bit of what about on the outline and what I'm hoping to cover today. First, I'll talk a little bit about representation and inclusion in STEM and natural resource fields as kind of a background and context to the way I approach the work I'm doing. And then I'll talk a bit about some research we're doing on equity and climate change, looking particularly at flood adaptation and the intersection of those things. And then we'll sort of broaden out to the concept of the way we approach conservation as a field and using an equity lens to investigate that further. I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. I am here on the University of Colorado Boulder, and we acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands: Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. I won't read the full land acknowledgement, but it is available online, and I would encourage you to look it up and engage with it and really think about how it shows up in your life. And I also want to just note that land acknowledgements in general, while important, are a first and minimum step in climate equity and climate justice efforts. And this includes, moving beyond that, recognizing oppression, marginalization, land dispossession of Native and Indigenous communities. Institutions in wealthier countries have significant legacy emissions and greater responsibility for taking action to address the climate crisis. And something that I always think about in my work, that past efforts at climate mitigation and natural resource management have done harm to marginalized communities and continue to do so. And then, of course, acknowledging our privileged position within society, particularly within the state of Colorado and Boulder County, for those of us who are joining from that location. So really just in taking this moment to encourage you to think about land acknowledgements and their role and how we think about our privilege and positionality in the context of the environment. So to sort of start things off, I want to orient us all to understanding some of the ways I'm thinking about equity and inequity in STEM. And I'm going to probably use these terms and then define them later, so bear with me on that. So I like this because it's a really great example of some of the somewhat unexpected ways that systems manifest to exacerbate or introduce inequity. So this is an article that a colleague of mine wrote a couple of years ago, acknowledging that some people only have one name, right? And so that's something that in every facet of life, every application you fill out, every grant you submit, every assignment you turn in, there's so many places where someone expects you to have two names. And culturally, this can add layers of just stress in day-to-day activities that you may or may not have anticipated. And so even something as, mundane isn't quite the right word, but something as sort of fine scale as a name can be reflective of the broader context and structures and sort of who's in charge. Another great example that I think is really relevant to STEM fields, but also kind of the way we do work in conservation and natural resources in particular, is the prevalence of unpaid positions. Many people who care about wildlife, for example, who want to go outside and study some charismatic species might be expected to do it for free. And the prevalence of unpaid jobs introduces a lot of opportunities for inequity and really privileges the capacity to go outside and do science. And so this figure here comes from some research that we just got published looking at the prevalence of paid and unpaid positions in conservation and related fields and what it means for long-term success of people who have paid and unpaid positions. Another kind of way that we're thinking about inequity is this concept of invisibility or invisibilization that happens in the process of doing science. So if you think about how we collect data, how we choose to identify variables that we think are going to be important, where we collect data, who we talk to, all of these processes, where funding goes, all of these processes can serve to reinforce the invisibility of certain groups. Those who might be undocumented, people who don't speak English. There are a myriad of ways in which the process of engaging in the scientific effort can create or exacerbate inequity. And so really taking a critical eye to, okay, how are we actually asking questions? Where are we doing work? Who are we leaving out? And is it because of the way we're approaching it or some broader systematic sort of structure that's beyond our control? So this is another way that we're thinking about this concept of equity in the way that we're doing science. Bringing it a little bit more to STEM fields and specifically this idea of race and representation, which is something close to home. I am often the only person of color in the spaces that I exist in, especially amongst faculty and other scholars, unless I'm intentionally going out of my way to be around BIPOC scholars. And so these figures serve to kind of represent that trend. This first one here on the left shows doctoral degrees awarded in STEM fields by race and ethnicity over time. The green bars are white students who have received PhDs, and the other bars are students of color. And it covers years 2000 to 2015 in 5-year increments. And you can see minimal change is the key takeaway there. And this other figure, hones in a little bit more on that trend and looks at specifically Black and Hispanic workers who remain underrepresented in the STEM workforce, right? So if you think about who's being awarded degrees in the field, that would lend itself to trends in who's actually being represented in the workforce. And representation sort of nationally and then across STEM jobs and then across specific subsets as well. Digging in a little bit more to the STEM field that I am most closely associated with is thinking about what's happening in the environmental fields and the environmental spaces. So this figure shows is sort of the best environment or ecology universities from US News and World Report. And their global ranks here. And so you can see different universities listed, including the University of Colorado Boulder. Yay for us being on this list. But it's looking at the percentage of enrollment, particularly comparing in these departments, comparing white and Black enrollment and also white and Black graduation rates. And you can see there are some significant discrepancies across these institutions. And again, thinking about what education translates into in terms of workforce and the fields of environment as a whole, this figure here comes from Dorceta Taylor and the Green 2.0 project's efforts to understand what environmental organizations look like in terms of hiring and management. So this figure shows representation of people of color across NGOs, government agencies, and foundations that are focused on environmental fields, and looking at interns, staff hired in the past 3 years, leadership and board slots, and you see a pretty significant decline in terms of representation, right? And so these discrepancies or these sort of limited representation are going to influence the priorities of these environmental organizations, who they're serving, who they might not be serving. And I think this manifests itself in the field of environment in a lot of ways. And sort of later in my talk, we'll discuss a little bit more about the origins and the history that have informed some of these realities today. But for now, I want to talk very specifically about some of the work that we've been doing to understand what this means for people of color in particular, who are in environmental, natural resource, ecology, and conservation fields. So this is a quote from a student who was starting fieldwork in an ecological setting. The word was said only once, but it echoed in her ears. She heard stories of the word thrown at others, including her parents, but the word was never used towards her. The N-word. It felt like a punch to the gut. She looked around to her peers and saw blank faces. She immediately began to question her decisions regarding work. Is this my new normal? Can I survive the field season when so much pain was inflicted on the first day? She thought back to her childhood, watching Steve Irwin on television with an infectious smile and bright optimism. She dreamt of being like him, traversing the outdoors to see all of the wondrous animals. Yet Steve Irwin did not look like her, nor did her peers. And so this was an early career student who was just getting into the field of ecology and had this experience and is unlikely to persist. And this comes from some interviews that we've been doing with BIPOC scholars in conservation. And so what we're finding is this ecosystem where you might be discriminated against, you're very likely to be isolated because you're so underrepresented and experience ridicule and exclusion as a result, often leads to one of two outcomes: leaving the field or going to try and stay and fix it and taking on that call to make the field better. And some of the people we've interviewed for this work have described themselves as being a martyr for the cause of equity in STEM. And so obviously that doesn't make for a sort of ideal working conditions for folks who are underrepresented in these environmental fields. And so the way that I address these concerns and address these challenges in my work is really thinking about humanity and equity embedded in conservation and natural resource management. So my soapbox really is just thinking about the humanity and the humanness of STEM, of conservation, of the environment. And so one example that I like to bring up here is from a different field. It's from the healthcare field, but I think it translates. So this figure here comes from some work done in 2019 looking at discrepancies in funding rates for Black scholars and white scholars for the National Institutes of Health. And what it's showing here are topic clusters with the highest percentage of applications from African-American or Black scholars. And you see there words like HIV, intervention, patient, health, and then topic clusters with fewer applications or no applications from African-American or Black scientists. And you can see that the words kind of lean more towards biophysical or sort of microbiological processes that are going on, as opposed to those informed by societal factors such as health or interventions or patients or communities. And pretty consistently, right? So this difference in terms of considering the humanity in healthcare versus just looking at the biology of healthcare has informed this 20% discrepancy in funding rates at the National Institutes of Health. And so this exclusion or this undervaluing of research that has the humanity and the human component embedded in it has led to discrepancies in fundings for decades in this agency in particular. So I really strongly push for, well, not doing that, really valuing research that's at the intersection of people, society, and sort of whatever kind of STEM discipline you're explicitly interested in this case, health. So I think about that a lot in my teaching. I think about that a lot in my research, and I'll provide a few more examples of that. But really, it's this idea that bringing in the humanity and the history of these fields can help us bring in more diverse perspectives. So one example of this that we have historically included in one of our introductory classes here is teaching about statistical methods and something like the chi-squared test or the regression test, and really looking at the history of those tests and the fact that they were often developed by and proliferated by eugenicists who were trying to use statistics to prove that some races were inferior, right? And it doesn't mean we don't use the test, right? It's math at its core, and there are ways to apply it to really important research questions, but there is an opportunity to acknowledge and talk about the ways in which science has been used to harm and how we need to think about that moving forward. So in my work, this really manifested for me in this shift from being a wildlife ecologist to being an interdisciplinary environmental social scientist, which is too many words, but sort of what I call myself today, where I was doing research in Southern Africa on wildlife and had this moment where I saw the community around me struggling with climate change that they weren't the cause of. And I knew that I needed to bring in my interest in social justice and my interest in people to my work on the environment. And so that's what I do now. And that's sort of how I bring that humanity piece into my work, looking at the links between history, identity, impacts of that history and identity and society, and really taking, looking at the opportunities of the way that I can do science that facilitates joy. So I think about joyful relationships between people and their environment in all that I do. And I think that really informs the interdisciplinary approach of my work. Okay, so I'll provide just a couple examples, two particular examples, but I wanted to first mention that I do this generally through inclusive and intersectional methods. And in my work, I'm often taking a systems approach where I'm thinking explicitly about human health and well-being, sustainability in the environment, and then really this broader social, historical, economic, political context, in as much as I'm able, with the scholarship that I do. So to provide an example of that, I'm going to talk about equity and climate change adaptation, particularly looking at flooding. Before I do that, though, I want to talk just a little bit about what climate justice or climate equity are. And so I'm going to actually pause here and ask you to put in the chat, what do you think these words mean? What is climate justice? What is climate equity? What are we referring to there? I know, put me on the spot. I appreciate that. I don't really know. Yeah, these things aren't generally well defined. We talk about them often in the abstract. And the reality is that they are quite difficult to define. AJ says, looking at how inequity affects the impacts of climate on all, ensuring everyone is getting the same benefits from climate policy, making sure no one is being negatively affected. Absolutely. David says, making sure we take care of all peoples who are typically unfairly affected by climate change. Absolutely. Kind of centering the most vulnerable and the most impacted. Yeah, how climate change reflects all members and effective interventions. Yep, including everybody in the process. Centering those most impacted. Wonderful. Yeah. So the reality is that these things are not very clearly defined and can manifest in a lot of different ways. I'll provide a few examples here, and this will be recorded, so you'll have it handy. So these are all from different sources. Climate justice acknowledges climate change can have differing social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts on underprivileged populations, right? We all don't experience climate change the same way. It is informed heavily by where we live, what we have access to, what we do. Climate justice explicitly links human rights and development to achieve a human-centered approach, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change, and its resolution equitably and fairly. It's informed by science, responds to science, and acknowledges the need for equitable stewardship of the world's resources. Climate equity means ensuring that the people most and communities who are least culpable, that's really, really important, least culpable in the warming of the planet and most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change did not suffer disproportionately as a result of historical adjustment and disinvestment, right? So thinking about who's been causing the negative climate impacts and who hasn't, and who's experiencing those vulnerabilities greater. So I want to dig in just a little bit more to what equity means in particular to translate it to this flooding context. So generally, I'm going to just define briefly 4 components of equity. So equity kind of broadly is just and fair inclusion, but we make a distinction between different components. So distributional equity is concerned with the allocation among different stakeholders of costs, risks, and benefits. If we do this thing to address this problem, who's going to have the costs and who's going to have the benefits? And really should be prioritizing those with the highest need. Procedural equity is looking at inclusive, acceptable, authentic engagement and representation in process to develop or implement programs or policies. Are you including meaningfully, inclusively, the people who should be involved in the discussion? Are you having activities at times when people can't come? Are you not including accessibility concerns or translators, right? How are you actually engaging with people who need to be a part of the conversation? Structural or contextual equity looks at institutionalized accountability. The idea that decisions are made with the recognition of historical, cultural, and institutional dynamics that have advantaged some and disadvantaged others. We can't just start from scratch, right? We have to recognize what's been happening historically and why that might influence the path that we're on and your potential willingness to engage with me directly, right? If you're mad at me, why would you sit down at a table and have a conversation with me? We have to look at that history and acknowledge it realistically before we can move forward. And then recognitional equity is respect for knowledge, systems, values, social norms, and rights of all stakeholders in policy or program design and implementation, right? So this is the idea that all ways of knowing, all cultures, all norms should be valued and included in these processes and not just some ideas of what's sort of right or what behavior is appropriate. There are more components of equity, but these are the ones we're going to focus on for this work. So operationalizing, we really wanted to take this equity framework and apply it, right? What does this mean in a real context? How can we better understand equity in the context of climate adaptation? So in the state of New York and really elsewhere in the world, mitigation and adaptation to increase flood risk takes often 2 forms. And I should also note here in Boulder, this was just on our ballot. So it's something that's very close to home as well. But in the specific context that we're looking at in upstate New York for this research, there's two strategies: buying out properties that have been flooded in the past or might be likely to flood in the future, and essentially demolishing them and protecting that land from flooding. And then the other approach is actually purchasing undeveloped land and protecting land to mitigate flood impacts and prevent development. Right, so it's sort of remove buildings that are exposed to flooding and protect land that might be exposed to flooding to protect watersheds, to protect water quality, and to minimize negative exposure and having people's homes flood. So again, I'm going to ask you in the chat, what might be some of the equity implications of this type of approach to flood mitigation and climate adaptation? Thinking about costs and benefits, thinking about who's included and procedures. And then I'll share what we are starting to find. Reduce affordable housing. Natalie has been working on this project, so I appreciate you chiming in, but she knows the answer. Thanks, Natalie. Absolutely, though. This decreases the amount of land available for development, which has important implications for where houses are or could be. Access to green space, absolutely. Potential focus on homeowners versus renters, for sure. Land that's purchased could be primarily owned by POCs, right? If you think about where affordable housing might have been to begin with, who might be losing a home? Displaced folks may not have right, where are people going to go? Are they implementing flood mitigation only in certain areas, despite them not being at the highest risk? Yeah, how are you making spatial decisions about where buyouts should be happening or where flood protection should be happening, and who's involved in that process? Absolutely, really, really great. Everybody's quick with it right there, coming up with all the right answers. So here's some of the preliminary findings. There's more robust analysis. We basically did in-depth interviews with a great point there, Dave, disruption of cultures. Yeah. With folks who are experiencing buyouts, who are participating in the process, or who live in communities where this is happening, to get a sense of what their perceptions are in terms of impacts to equity. So in terms of distribution, one of the things I didn't quite mention is that the driver, this is happening in upstate New York, but the driver of these land buyout efforts is to protect water quality for the city of New York. So there's this real urban rural sort of discrepancy in terms of who's benefiting. And there's an important loss of local tax income, disruption of cultures, as was mentioned, very few opportunities for relocation, decreased housing availability, and increased housing costs. In terms of procedural equity, participation in this program is voluntary. No one's going to force you to sell your property. And they actually did consider this aspect of procedure and stipulated that rural town leadership has to sign off, right? So the town has some say in this process or on any property or land acquisition. And so the program does attempt to consider the inclusion of community needs as a whole. How it could be more inclusive. There's a ton of administrative capacity needed to participate. The bureaucracy, the red tape is high. Not every community who might want this has the capacity to participate. But in general, alternative flood mitigation options are limited. And so rural towns seem to be making a decision where there's no good option, which really brings up the question of, are they making a decision, or is this just the only thing that they could possibly do? In terms of structural and contextual equity, these are rural areas that include regions where eminent domain has been used to displace others in the past. So there's already this really strong tension in terms of what is the state of New York doing here right now? What is the city of New York doing here right now? And so these efforts don't really acknowledge that history nor the current tensions that exist as a result. In terms of recognitional equity, the rights and values of local communities aren't prioritized or being centered. And this focus on land protection and water quality, perhaps over economic well-being and resident needs. And really, no one's actually collecting data on that. Do we know what happens to these communities when we do these buyouts? Do we know what happens to the people living in these areas? There was a mention of renters versus owners, which is something that's coming through. The clinic, the pharmacy, some of these essential services are in buildings that are rented and might need to be bought out. And in rural areas, there might not be other alternatives in terms of where folks can go. So what can we do? The way we're thinking about this work is really just broadening the discussion. Again, bringing in the humanity, bringing in the history, bringing in the context to these discussions, making the invisible visible, making the external internal. So right now, this is essentially what's happening. There's some measure or understanding of flood risk, and then there's some effort to address flood adaptation. But this approach leaves out a lot of these other components: flood risk, economic vitality, community empowerment, past injustice, future success of these communities. And so really, when we're thinking about climate adaptation, or really any environmental management approach in general, we can't just think about, okay, A to B, this is happening in the environment, so we need to do this to protect it. We have to expand our understanding. How can we ensure that money is still coming into these communities? How can we incorporate the cost of the bureaucracy and red tape to get this done into the overall process? How can we think about community empowerment? How can we think about the inherent tensions between what a property owner is doing and what the community as a whole might need? And so it doesn't necessarily point to an easy solution, but it points to the need for a more robust and inclusive process that thinks about all of these different layers, rather than just saying we're going to fix flooding and doing the one thing that you think is going to fix flooding. We are finding, of course, that there are important interactions and trade-offs, that different components of equity interact in really interesting and important ways. So overlooking contextual equity may limit your ability to include procedural equity. As I said, if someone's mad at you, they may be unwilling to trust you or engage with you in this process. So before anyone might expand the discussion or get more people to the table, really thinking about the history of these relationships is important. They also interact with other related principles: justice, responsibility, accessibility, belonging, and there may really be trade-offs. Processes that are inclusive take a lot of time to do well. A community might argue you that action is needed right now, and a slow process is an unjust process. And you have to meaningfully consider these trade-offs between how are we going to include as many people as possible, but do this at a pace that the community feels serves them. An inclusive process also has the potential to overburden under-resourced communities, with implications for sort of who should be responsible for these processes as a whole, and how are you going to get the right people involved. There are no easy answers. So, I think this is a really great example of something that we're all thinking about. How are we going to manage lands that are more likely to flood, more likely to experience fire, more likely to be exposed to hazards as a whole? But how can we do this? How can we approach this in a way that considers equity? I guess I'll pause here and see if anybody has any questions about this topic before I switch gears and talk a little bit more about our equity approach to conservation. Okay. Just making sure, living with the silence, encouraging people to speak or type. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about, so that was kind of our approach to understanding equity and inclusion in the context of climate adaptation. Now I want to talk about equity and bringing an equity lens to conservation. And so the question that's really driving this work is how has the history of the environmental movement as a whole in the US and more broadly, shape inclusion and exclusion in conservation. I need to say more before I do that. Okay, so the context for this work is really the concept of conservation in the US is framed around this idea of the North American model for wildlife conservation. And it is an approach to conserving wildlife that has 7 tenets, which I'll go through, that basically guide the way that we manage wildlife and how we think about wildlife management and conservation in the US, and which we have exported to other countries as well. And the people who came up with the North American model for wildlife conservation many years ago represented a very small segment of the US population. It was white, male, wealthy hunters. And they were the ones who really felt like they needed to do something about conservation in the US, despite all that was already happening in many indigenous communities all over the United States at the time, to address conservation challenges. But if you think about it, that specific type of individual is going to view and value a very specific relationship with the environment that maybe everybody else doesn't value, right? That's a very specific way of interacting with nature that doesn't represent everyone. And so that the people who were involved in developing this model and that history has likely informed, how conservation happens here in the US and the world over, and whose voices, perspectives, ways of engaging might not be represented. So I'll quickly go through some of these tenets of this model of wildlife conservation and sort of bring this equity lens and criticism to it. So, and I would love for you all to engage in the chat. So with each of the principles, I would love for you to maybe hypothesize what about it might not be inherently equitable. So the first principle is wildlife is a communal resource held in the public trust by the government. Is there anything about this? The principle, I think, as a whole, right? We all essentially own wildlife, but the government sort of holds it in the public trust. Is there anything inherently exclusive about this? Doesn't necessarily recognize who was there from the beginning, doesn't acknowledge government stole land, distribution permits may not be equitable. Absolutely. Definitely the concept of government, right, as a whole, and who might have been left out of government regulations from an indigenous perspective is really kind of core to challenges here. The other piece of this is our sort of conservation management ideals derive from a very unique Anglo-European context that doesn't really take into account non-Western ideologies or frameworks. And so the model holds up this concept of that the government is the steward over lands and resources that previously belonged to no one or were not being used efficiently, which obviously isn't the case. And excludes, right, the many ways of knowing and Indigenous history and Indigenous natural resource management that was happening long before we set up this model. So the second principle is elimination of markets. We shouldn't be hunting wildlife to then sell in economic markets. And one of the reasons, or one of the potential reasons, and the goal of this was that many wildlife were being slaughtered in mass because of these markets. So the common example is that birds, the feathers from birds were being used in women's hats. One of the reasons why this is a problematic, and I would encourage you to put in the chat other thoughts on why this might be a problematic principle, is that they were pretty clear about who was to blame for the problematic use of these natural resources, of this wildlife. So this is a quote from a leader at the time. I'm quite certain that their disappearance, this is in reference to insectivorous birds in the Northeast, has been caused, or all over the sort of Eastern US, has been caused by the slaughter of them for food, in the North by the Italians, and in the South by the Negroes, right? So there was an inherently xenophobic and racist understanding of some of the drivers of markets in the US. The third tenet, or third principle, is allocation of wildlife by the law. What might be problematic about this tenet or principle? The law. Just the law as a concept. Yeah, and there's so much in that, right? Whose law? What law? How are we defining it? You know, the reality that that wildlife can be allocated, right? This idea of ownership, that we can possess and then allocate wildlife. Absolutely. And then, you know, the sort of very clear history in the US that the law has not been equitably treated or sort of approached across all of us, right? People live in wilderness, people live, and one thing that I should back up and say is, like, a lot of this, because this model was set up by people who had a very specific relationship with wildlife, it really narrowed this idea of what nature and wilderness is or could be. And absolutely, it did limit Indigenous diets, and that's linked to the next principle as well. But yeah, this tenet doesn't take into consideration the often inequitable and oppressive relationship between the US government and its people, right? Particularly Indigenous people, particularly people of color. Principle 4, wildlife should only be killed for a legitimate purpose. What might be problematic with this tenet? Yeah, this one, the use of the word legitimate is really problematic. Who's defining legitimate? And again, well, we know who's defining it, right? It's this very specific swath of the population. And so there's a quote here: those who killed merely for the fun of killing, along with pot hunters, those who hunted solely for food, debased sport hunting. True sportsmen were those who hunted for pleasure, never for profit, who in the field allowed game a sporting chance, and who possessed an aesthetic appreciation of the whole context of sport, right? So this is a very specific way of thinking about wildlife. It excludes, right, any population that might be living off of the meat from nature or the other resources from nature, and really has this narrow and specific view about how wildlife should be treated. So yeah, really this one is, I think, problematic in a perhaps more obvious way, in that it's pretty exclusionary. Principle 5, wildlife as an international resource. What do we think about this principle? The idea behind this one focuses on the reality that species don't recognize political boundaries, and that a sovereign state's interests could be affected by other management, and that cooperative management benefits wildlife kind of across borders. This one is perhaps a little bit more nuanced. I think a lot of people would argue that wildlife treated as a resource could be inherently problematic. How is resource defined? How should we even be thinking about wildlife in this context as a resource? Another one, it could potentially promote people moving across borders to access resources, or putting up borders, right, to control their resources in as much as they're able to. One that is often overlooked in the context of this, would this ignore where wildlife belongs natively, potentially, right? Considering the natural movement of wildlife, but also could force wildlife out, right? If we are putting up borders for the sake of controlling our resource. One critical component here is that indigenous nations and communities have rarely been recognized as sovereign entities in the context of this principle. Right. So when you're thinking about management of wildlife as a resource, even if you're okay with that as an idea, the idea of sovereign nations and who is considered a sovereign nation has been problematic historically. Yeah, that's at the Canadian border to stop Canadian geese. Yeah. Okay. Almost there. Principle 6, 2 more to go. Science should be the determining factor in allocation of uses of natural resources. Yeah, Colorado-born wolves shot in Wyoming because they crossed the state border. Yeah, really recent news happening here. What might be problematic about this principle that we should be relying on science to manage and allocate these natural resources? Science has been exclusive, absolutely. Science is not equitable. Who is science? Who's science? Science can and is biased as well, absolutely. So yeah, that's sort of I think that the crux of this one is just what science is and how people have historically thought about, used, and excluded certain ways of knowing within science. And then also, I think, there are many people who would take issue with this idea of allocation and ownership over natural resources as well. And finally, principle 7, every citizen has an opportunity under the law to hunt and fish in the United States and Canada. What do we think about this principle? Who is a citizen? Absolutely. Yeah. When this law was made, would I have been considered a citizen? Right. And who are we even thinking about citizen today excludes, right? Lots of people who should have access to resources, green space, the environment. Another component of this one is the emphasis on hunting and fishing. It completely excludes non-consumptive, hiking, going outside, having access to green space. None of that is a focus here at all, which again, not surprising considering who set this up. But it doesn't sort of afford any additional rights or access to nature other than hunting and fishing. Are the processes to legally hunting accessible? Yeah, lots of people can't, right? Even though you might legally be able to. Whether or not you can or have access to hunting and fishing is a whole other question. And then again, the limits and who decides what those limits look like. So this, yeah, looking at wildlife through the lens of hunting is strange to me. That's a really great point, David, and I appreciate you saying that. This is what we did. This is the model. This is why there are national parks, right? We came up with this model and then we made national parks, and then we exported it all over the world and they made national parks. And imagine, right? Imagine if more people were at the table when this was set up. Imagine if we had a broader way of thinking about this 200 years ago, how we would be thinking about wildlife, how would we be thinking about conservation and development in more inclusive and broader ways. And so that's something that's really driving me there. And I want to collaborate with some creatives and think about what that imagining would look like. Okay, so we're not just going to end on a low note. And I should also, right, I am intentionally taking a critical equity lens at this conservation model, but right, I benefit from living near Rocky Mountain National Park, right? I benefit from the wildlife that has been preserved from this model. And even though I think there's a lot that's problematic about it, and I'm constantly forcing us all to think more broadly about what conservation can and should be, I don't want to discount everything about it. So when we're thinking about this work, a lot of what we're encouraging people to do to kind of advance or broaden the North American model is to think about wilderness as an inclusive space. right? It's not just for fishing and hunting, right? As I'm sure many on this call would agree. We all should be able to engage with nature, engage with wildlife, engage with the outdoors in a myriad of ways. One approach to that is centering underrepresented narratives. And so I list a few organizations here that are doing that work and are thinking about how are people of color in particular interacting with and engaging with the outdoors. And let's amplify and center those stories so we can shift the narrative about what a relationship with the outdoors can look like, and what many diverse relationships with the outdoors can and should look like. Another way we're thinking about this work, and it's sort of aligned with this, the narratives, is in inclusive, broad relationships with nature. Again, the concept of nature, the concept of the outdoors as separate from people, inherently excludes people who interact with nature in urban settings, for example, people who might be farming and are interacting with the environment in that capacity. So really thinking about and broadening our perspective of what nature is, what conservation can look like, and how all types of relationships with the environment are valid and should be protected and conserved. And then, of course, this is kind of really core to a lot of the thinking in this space, and I think lends itself to a lot of the conversation around kind of decolonizing our learning and research, is really thinking about other ways of knowing and centering Indigenous knowledge systems and conservation as well. And this particular figure comes from an article that's thinking about this idea of translocations of wildlife for conservation purposes, and how Indigenous voices and Indigenous ways of knowing should be brought into this. There's also a really great article, Indigenizing the North American Model, and a lot of work being done right now on decolonial methods in conservation that contribute to this conversation as well. Okay, I need you all to know I'm very proud of myself because I'm almost to my last slide. I was able to ask you questions and I didn't have to rush too much. So go me. So when I'm thinking about both climate adaptation and conservation, in order to be successful and inclusive, they demand a human-centered equity approach. And this really makes it more likely that we develop sustainable and effective solutions. We don't exacerbate existing inequity. We can potentially start to overcome historical injustices, and we solve environmental problems in inclusive ways. And that's a typo, but really, I think the big perspective here is that, especially in the context of climate adaptation, we have a real opportunity here to do better, to take climate change and the need and the urgency that it creates to address equity challenges, right? To think about and incorporate equity in the work that we're doing, to take this as an opportunity to transform the way we approach the environment. So that's, I guess, where a lot of my optimism in this space comes from. I see it as an opportunity to bring this human joy inclusion approach. So I will pause there and acknowledge my collaborators and co-authors and those who have been involved and supported this work. And yeah, I think we have time for any other questions that folks might have. And I got the sun coming in, so give me a second.
Well, I'll help field questions, but want to note you're getting some love shown your way in the chat, and some great expressions of gratitude coming with the emojis.
Yeah. Can I just quickly say thank you so much, Dr. Bailey. I am so excited about your work and really selfishly want to talk to you and meet you in person. My son, I've actually been talking a lot to him about thinking about this sort of way to interact with science. He's very much about social justice, and I think that what you're doing is incredible. It's not only the future, it's the past and the present, but I'm really excited about the climate summit and wondering if you're going to be there, because maybe I'm going to find you. I don't know. Anyway, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for doing this for us and bring awareness to this really important work. Thank you. And making it accessible.
Awesome. Yeah, I appreciate that. I would love to chat with you, your son, and anybody else on the call who's interested in this topic. I'm more than happy to have a conversation. I do think it's imperative, right, that we bring as many different perspectives, voices, disciplines, values, right, into this work in order to do it right. So yes, and then yeah, good opportunity to plug the Right Here, Right Now Climate Summit, where there is an explicit and intentional approach to thinking about climate change from a human rights perspective. I will be involved in presenting kind of a little bit, like it won't be, I have a poster and it's basically less of what I've shown you today. So you got the gist of anything I'll be doing, but we can certainly talk.
We do have a couple minutes for additional questions or comments. Just want to note that this session will be posted in just a few days on the Be Well website. Also, please check out our monthly Let's See You Well offerings. We'll post them as they come. I am happy to pause and just wait for questions or comments that come up. But in the meantime, let's give Dr. Bailey another round of love for us, whether you want to say anything in the chat or with your emojis or just your energy. Such an excellent presentation today. So a deep bow of gratitude on my end for you and all of our participants today. Great comments coming through, and I hope you can see the emojis as well.
Yeah. I'd love to hear for anybody who's around, if you're learning about this topic or if you're doing any research, you know, how you might be thinking about this and these topics in the work that you do. Hi, Lauren.
Just one. Oh, good. Go ahead, Lauren.
I'll just talk because nobody else is talking about it. I guess, you know, this is awesome. And I'm just curious, like, and we all have very different roles, both on this campus and in society and all those things. I'm curious if you have, you know, I can see a real clear path for people who are sort of like working in these areas to be centering more voices and thinking about these things. But like for, you know, just sort of more broadly, how are we going to move more people towards this, or more structures and more systems of power towards this?
Easy question there.
I tried to start small.
I mean, I guess, you know, the way that I approach it, or the thing that I encourage everyone to do, kind of no matter what it is that they do, right? We all exist within systems. All of us do our work, we go to school, we show up, we, you know, whatever within a system. And I think looking at the history of that system, how did it come to be this way? Why is it set up this way? Who might have been included, who might have been excluded in that process, and just really thinking critically about where we have come from and how that's led to the current state of affairs is, I think, just a really valuable first step and opportunity for self-reflection and growth. In terms of how we translate that into action and change, that's a much more difficult question. But I think bringing that understanding and bringing that history to discussions about, you know, the work that you're doing, your field, whatever it may be, can start to move us in the right direction. And then, you know, accountability of people in charge to do the same type of work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, I'm seeing your question in the chat now.
Well, it looks like people are signing off. So one more bow of gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. We look forward to seeing you at the next Let's See You Well. And thank you to all of our participants today for creating such a great community around this topic.
Thanks, everybody.
Check out the website and we'll post the recording. Also have a link to the conference coming up, the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit. And that will be on the Be Well website as well. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming. See you at the next one.
Thanks all.